So this is the logical flow of Victor's paper. Victor basically go out to estimate the total amount of accumulated debt that the Chinese government has by adding these four components, okay? And the bonds, the loans to SOEs, asset management, corporation, these are the bonds that are stripped from the banking system and put in an asset management company, and a triangular debt. And he comes up with a 36.8 trillion RMB, which is equivalent to about 190% of GDP. It's a huge amount because government borrows a huge amount, so government has incentive to monetize this debt. And therefore, the government is reluctant to increase interest rate. There's always have an incentive to flood the market with excess liquidity, and this ultimately eventually leads to the high inflation. And which leads to another conclusion that in China, you being Chinese savers, my parents, you screwed up. And to the purpose of enriching the debtors, which is huge government. Well, 190% of GDP of the total accumulated debt for the government is a huge number. It is very difficult. It's hard for me to swallow. The reason I say this is because this is much bigger than Greece. Greece total is 140% of GDP. And this is 2 times of Ireland. And we know what happened to Greece, and we know what happened to Ireland. And this is 3 times of larger as Spain, right? So I'm not so sure about this 190%. And besides, the paper is saying that this 190% GDP is a liability of the Chinese government, is ultimately responsible by Chinese government, which is not very well defined. What do you mean by ultimately responsible? I can see that Chinese government is ultimately responsible for the bonds they issue, they have to pay them. Does that mean that for every SOE's loans, that if they go bad, the Chinese government have to come in to buy them? Or they don't have to, okay? So maybe this 190% of cumulative debt is the upper bound of the total liability of the government if they have to buy all of this responsible for them, without considering the Social Security. But on the other hand, you also have to consider that the default rate and how safe these loans are, and if they are safe, and the government doesn't have to worry about that, right? And if you look at this, the banking, this is the non-performing loans of the Chinese banks in 2006 all the way to 2009. And I don't have the data for 2010, so I don't know what happened in the next year. But if you truly trust Chinese data, seems to be that we, otherwise we wouldn't be here sitting in this room. The Chinese banks are the healthiest bank in the world now. Right? It's much better than the American banks. So I wouldn't worry about these loans, right? I mean, so the default rate of this, the non-performing loans is another indicator that one have to look into this. Back to this, government incentive to monetize this debt. You don't have to have a huge debt to get these conclusions. Any debtors has incentive to monetize the debt, right? I mean, if the central bank is not independent from the political process, the politicians will have incentive to do this. But whether this is a reality or not in China, I'm not so sure. If you look at this, this is the interest rate. The upper part is the Chinese benchmark interest rate. And the down part is the Federal Reserve federal funds rate targeted. Except the timing is different. Chinese interest rate very much similar like the US interest rate. You can think about the Chinese run the monetary policy as the same way as the American Federal Reserve Bank running its monetary policy. In the same way, Chinese central bank has two goals they have to achieve. One is to maintain stable prices, low inflation, and high inflation, as Barry talked about this morning, that is deadly to the regime. This is happened in 1989 and happened in 1994. So very much in the mind of the Chinese leadership, high inflation causes social stability. So that's the one thing that the government has in mind. And the second goal that the government has in mind is the growth. You want to generate enough jobs like in the United States, otherwise the regime will not be there. So this is, as far as the interest rate, Chinese interest has been as high as 11% in 1996, 1997 during this time period. And in no way in a time period throughout the history, Chinese interest as low as the United States, close to 0%. So back to, this is the inflation, so what happened here? Well, this is the M2 percentage change in China. If throughout most of the recent history, Chinese liquidity is pretty reasonable. If you look at the average before 2009, average growth of the pseudo money, the growth rate of M2 is about 15%. And throughout, it's quite reasonable. I'm enough. There's only two spikes. One is 2008, early, this is right after the Lehman Brothers and all those financial crises, the panic in China, they bump up the liquidity. And this is the first quarter, the fourth quarter of 2008, and the Chinese pump a huge liquidity, 25% of growth, liquidity into the market. Otherwise, if you look at this, it's just these two periods that Chinese just ran into the huge liquidity. If you look at the inflation rate, besides this two spike in 1989, we know what happened in 1989 and in 1994, inflation rate in China pretty tamed, on average about 5%. Probably it will go up more than 5% as Barry talked about, so I'm not going to get into this. So this huge liquidity, where this money go, without the inflation? So after this, this is my side of the story, okay? This is my side of the story. This is Devil's story, based on Victor's paper and my reinterpretation. Probably the total government debt is probably between the 20 trillion RMB and 63.8 trillion, like Victor estimated. In between that, 20 trillion is the total amount of bond that the government is responsible for that. But these conclusions doesn't necessarily have a logical flow. So I'm just listing this here. The government has an incentive to monetize this debt any part of the world. This is true. Monetary policy is conducted mainly by based on balancing inflation and growth, like in the United States. Interest rates are still very much non-market determined. Government determines this. The government does not hesitate to increase or decrease the interest rate to reach its goal. Inflation in recent years is relatively tamed. The question is that where these extra liquidity goes. The last conclusion is the savers of the world to be aware. You'll be screwed up. Okay? I'm going to the second paper, Yonghen's paper. Yonghen wants to achieve these two objectives. One is why the stimulus package could achieve such a large and rapid effects in China. Second question, what is the relationship with the rising housing price of this stimulus package? And their main conclusion by the paper is that the explanation is that, well, it's because the central bank ordered the SOE banks to lend, and they lent. The central bank ordered the central SOEs to invest, and they invested. So therefore, there's a huge impact on the economy. GDP goes up, and economy bounces back. And the problem is that much of the ordered credit and investment be channeled through the real estate sector, and therefore it causes real estate bubbles, and which has a resource misallocation cost. That's the downside of stimulus policy. Well, the problem is that Yonghen didn't really answer the first question. At least by the end of the paper reading this, still not clear to me. Well, the reason here is that if central bank ordered the SOE banks to lend, and most of the money goes to the SOE, central SOE, and they invest in the real estate, build up the land prices. That is not apples and bananas produced in the economy. Right? The question here is that why the stimulus package is so powerful, so useful, where these apples and bananas coming from? It's not the land prices. Okay? So so the first question is not answered, but the second question is quite interesting, that they do find that the housing, I have 2 more minutes because Bob is out. And well, the problem here is that, well, there is a huge liquidity there in 2009. And there's huge, and by the way, in the paper, there is no place in the paper that I found there's direct evidence suggesting the Chinese government ordered SOE banks to lend, and there is no direct evidence in the paper that the Chinese government ordered the SOE centrally owned SOE to invest. There is no direct evidence that. But I do see there's a huge liquidity there in 2009. Well, given the huge liquidity and my non-performing loans is so low, why not? I'll make the loans, I'll make an investment. And certainly the real estate is the best place to speculate because money is so cheap. It's just given by the government, by the SOE, and a very low interest rate, why not? So I want to do that. And in fact, this is not a China phenomenon. If you look around the world, in fact, it's Singapore, where Yongheng came from. There's a huge run-up of housing prices in comparison with China. China is peanuts. It's 9%, in Singapore is 23%, right? So, the problem here is that a huge liquidity across the board around the world. All the countries went into the stimulus policy and the Keynesian policy, and this run up the asset prices and run up another bubble. So, so this is my side of the story, the devil's side of the story. I'm up. Why the stimulus package could achieve such a large and rapid effect in China? Answer: I don't know. Well, I do know, and I have, but there's speculation. We can talk about it off the stage. What is the relationship with the rising housing prices? The government pumped a large liquidity in 2009 into the economy, and the credit is cheap, and why not? And there's the money goes to, lots of the money goes to the state-owned enterprises, and they invested in the real estate and bid up the real estate prices. So the problem is that the Keynes is still alive and kicking. And that's the danger, that's the problem. And we might see another bubbles down the road, and people never learn lessons. All right, I'm up.